In the scorching desert of Afghanistan, enemy soldiers whispered about a ghost who killed without being seen. They called him Mirage because, like the desert illusions that fool thirsty travelers, he appeared where he shouldn't exist and vanished before anyone could prove he was real. For 3 years, this mysterious sniper haunted their nightmares, taking impossible shots from distances that defied human capability. What they didn't know was that behind the legend stood a quiet farm boy from Oklahoma named Jake Morrison, whose journey from milking cows at dawn to becoming the most feared marksman in military history would challenge everything we think we know about heroes, war, and the thin line between survival and madness. This is his story, raw, unfiltered, and more incredible than any Hollywood movie could ever capture. Jake Morrison never planned to become a killer. Growing up on a cattle ranch in Broken Bow, Oklahoma, his biggest worry was whether the morning milking would finish before school started. His hands, now steady enough to thread a bullet through a keyhole at 1,000 yards, once trembled with nervousness when asking Sarah Jenkins to the high school dance. The transformation began on a Tuesday morning in March 2008, when Jake found his father collapsed in the barn. Heart attack. By the time the ambulance arrived, Tom Morrison was gone, leaving behind a mountain of debt, a struggling ranch, and an 18-year-old son who suddenly became the man of the house overnight. Jake's mother, Mary, tried to hold things together, but the medical bills and mortgage payments crushed their family like a slow avalanche. The bank gave them 6 months. Jake worked 3 jobs, bagging groceries at Peterson's Market, fixing engines at Murphy's Garage, and loading hay bales for neighboring ranches. His hands bled from the work, his back ached constantly, but still the money wasn't enough. That's when Sergeant Rodriguez visited Broken Bow High School for a recruitment presentation. Jake sat in the back row, half listening to promises about college money and career training. But when Rodriguez mentioned the signing bonus, $20,000, Jake's attention snapped into focus like a rifle scope finding its target. After the presentation, Jake approached the recruiter. Rodriguez was a compact man with kind eyes and scars on his knuckles that told stories Jake couldn't yet understand. "You thinking about serving your country, son?" "I'm thinking about saving my family's ranch," Jake replied honestly. Rodriguez studied him for a moment. "Fair enough. That's as good a reason as any." He handed Jake a business card. "Talk to your mother. If you decide to join, ask for me specifically. I'll make sure you get into a program that uses whatever talents you've got." That night, Jake sat at the kitchen table with his mother, the business card between them like a bridge to an uncertain future. Mary Morrison had already lost her husband. The thought of losing her only son to war made her hands shake as she poured coffee. "The ranch has been in our family for 4 generations, Jake said quietly. "Dad would want me to save it." "Your father would want you alive more than he'd want dirt and cattle," Mary replied, but her voice lacked conviction. They both knew the ranch was more than property, it was their identity, their history, their connection to Tom Morrison's memory. 3 weeks later, Jake signed the papers. Rodriguez kept his word, recommending Jake for specialized training based on his exceptional eyesight and steady hands, skills developed from years of hunting rabbits and coyotes that threatened the ranch's chickens. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, was a shock to Jake's system. The drill sergeants screamed constantly, the physical demands pushed his farm-strong body to new limits, and the other recruits came from worlds Jake had never imagined: inner-city streets, suburban neighborhoods, military families with generations of service. But Jake adapted. His rural upbringing had taught him patience, persistence, and the ability to endure discomfort without complaining. While other recruits cracked under pressure, Jake absorbed the lessons with quiet determination. He learned to disassemble and reassemble weapons blindfolded, to move silently through different terrains, and to calculate wind speed and bullet drop with mathematical precision. The first time Jake fired a sniper rifle, something clicked into place inside his mind. The M24 felt natural in his hands, like an extension of his body. His first shot, aimed at a target 600 yards away, hit dead center. The range instructor, a grizzled veteran named Master Sergeant Collins, lowered his binoculars and whistled softly. "Son, you ever done this before?" "Just hunting, Sergeant. Rabbits mostly." Collins walked over and examined the target through his scope again. "Well, I'll be damned. You just graduated from rabbits to something a lot more serious. Advanced marksmanship training took Jake to a classified facility in Nevada, where the military's elite snipers learned their deadly craft. Here, Jake met men who had already served multiple tours, whose eyes held shadows of experiences Jake couldn't yet comprehend. They taught him about patience, how to lie motionless for hours waiting for the perfect shot. They taught him about reading weather patterns, about accounting for the Coriolis effect at extreme distances, about the psychology of long-distance killing. The psychological training was the hardest part. Jake learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to view targets as threats rather than people, to accept that his role in modern warfare was that of a surgical instrument, precise, efficient, and emotionally detached. The instructors showed videos of terrorist attacks, explained the importance of protecting American soldiers and civilians, and gradually reshaped Jake's farmboy conscience into something harder and more focused. During this training, Jake earned his nickname. During a live-fire exercise, he made an impossible shot through a gap in rocks that shouldn't have allowed a clear line of sight. When the instructors investigated, they found Jake had used the heat shimmer from the desert floor, a Mirage effect, to bend his line of sight around the obstacle. It was a technique that defied conventional wisdom but worked perfectly in Jake's capable hands. "How did you even think to try that?" asked Lieutenant Warner, the training officer. Jake shrugged. Back home, heat shimmer always made things look different than they were. Figured it might work the other way too. From that day forward, his fellow snipers called him Mirage, and the name stuck like desert dust on combat boots. Jake's first deployment came in September 2009, when he was assigned to a forward operating base in Afghanistan's Helmand province. The landscape reminded him of western Oklahoma, dry, harsh, and unforgiving, but the similarities ended there. This was a land at war, where every shadow might hide an enemy and every decision could mean the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. His spotter was a seasoned corporal named Danny Reeves from Detroit, a street-smart kid who could read people like road signs and had an almost supernatural ability to judge wind conditions. Danny had survived 2 previous tours and took Jake under his wing with the protective instinct of an older brother. "First rule out here," Danny explained as they set up their position overlooking a suspected Taliban supply route, "forget everything you think you know about fairness and honor. These aren't opponents in a sporting match. They're trying to kill American soldiers, and our job is to stop them first. You hesitate, good men die. You understand?" Jake nodded, but understanding intellectually and accepting emotionally were two different things. His first confirmed kill came 3 days later, when he spotted an insurgent placing an improvised explosive device along a road frequently traveled by American convoys. Through his scope, Jake could see the man's face clearly, younger than Jake himself, with careful hands and focused concentration. For a moment, Jake hesitated. The man looked like any of the farmhands who had worked for Jake's family over the years. But then, Jake imagined that bomb exploding under a convoy carrying soldiers like himself, young men with families and dreams and futures they'd never see if the device wasn't stopped. Jake's bullet traveled 800 yards in less than a second, ending the threat with surgical precision. The insurgent never knew what hit him. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling and replaying the shot over and over in his mind. Danny noticed Jake's restlessness and sat beside his bunk. "First one's always the hardest," Danny said quietly. "You did good today. Saved a lot of American lives. Doesn't make it easier." "No, it doesn't. But it makes it necessary." Danny paused, choosing his words carefully. "You want some advice? Don't try to forget it, but don't let it consume you either. That man chose to plant bombs that would kill our guys. You chose to stop him. Hold on to that truth when the doubts come." Jake nodded, but he was beginning to understand that war would change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The farm boy from Oklahoma was disappearing, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Each shot would carve away another piece of his former self, until only the sniper remained. Over the following weeks, Jake's reputation grew. His accuracy was uncanny, his patience legendary, and his ability to make seemingly impossible shots earned him respect from even the most experienced operators. But, with each successful mission, Jake felt himself drifting further from the person he had been. The letters he wrote home became shorter and less personal. The dreams of returning to the ranch grew fainter, replaced by a growing understanding that he might never really leave this desert, even if his body eventually made it back to Oklahoma. The transformation was accelerating, and Jake Morrison was beginning to realize that becoming Mirage might cost him everything he had originally joined the military to save. 6 months into his deployment, Jake had recorded 23 confirmed kills and had become the most requested sniper in his unit. But success in war comes with a price that accountants never calculate. Jake's letters home stopped coming altogether, and when his mother called the base, he made excuses to avoid talking to her. The Oklahoma farm boy who once worried about asking girls to dances now lay motionless for days at a time, watching enemy compounds through his scope with the patience of a spider waiting for flies. The mission that would define Jake's legend began on a scorching July morning when intelligence reported a high-value target in a village called Marja. Abu Hassan al-Baghdadi was a bomb maker whose devices had killed 37 American soldiers in the past year. He was also, according to intercepted communications, planning something bigger, a coordinated attack on 3 forward operating bases that could kill hundreds. Jake and Danny were part of a 4-man team tasked with elimination. The other 2 members were Staff Sergeant Martinez, a demolitions expert from Texas, and Corporal Thompson, a communications specialist from Maine. They would insert by helicopter under cover of darkness, establish an overwatch position, and wait for the target to show himself. The helicopter dropped them 3 miles from the village, and they moved through the night like ghosts across the rocky terrain. Jake carried his customized M24 sniper rifle, a weapon he had modified with better optics and a custom trigger that responded to the slightest pressure. Danny carried the spotting scope, rangefinder, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. They established their position on a ridgeline overlooking Marja just as dawn painted the eastern sky purple and gold. Through his scope, Jake could see the compound where Hassan was reportedly staying, a 2-story mud brick building surrounded by high walls and occupied by at least a dozen armed men. For 18 hours, they waited. Jake's body became one with the rocky ground, his breathing synchronized with the desert wind, his eyes never leaving the scope. Danny fed him information about wind speed, temperature changes, and the movement of people below. Martinez and Thompson maintained security and communication with base. It was Danny who first spotted their target. "Movement, 2nd floor, east window," he whispered. Jake shifted his aim and found a bearded man in white robes examining something on a table: wires, batteries, and what looked like plastic explosives. Through the scope's powerful magnification, Jake could see the man's face clearly. Hassan was younger than expected, maybe 35, with intelligent eyes and careful hands. He was showing a younger man how to connect detonators to a timing device. "Range?" Jake asked softly. 1,120 yards, Danny replied after calculating the distance. "Wind is calm, temperature steady. You've got a clean shot." But just as Jake was preparing to fire, Hassan moved away from the window. For the next 4 hours, they caught only glimpses of him, a shadow moving past a doorway, a figure on the roof for a few seconds before disappearing again. Hassan was cautious, never staying in one place long enough for a clear shot. As the sun reached its peak, the heat became unbearable. The rocks they lay on felt like cooking stones, and their water supplies dwindled. Jake's camouflage uniform was soaked with sweat, but he remained motionless, scope trained on the compound below. "This guy knows we're here," Danny muttered. "He's too smart, too careful." Jake didn't respond, but he was thinking the same thing. Hassan's movements showed a pattern. He was deliberately avoiding clear lines of sight, staying close to walls, using the building's architecture as protection. Either he knew snipers were watching, or he lived every day assuming someone might be. That's when Jake noticed something interesting. Every hour, like clockwork, Hassan appeared briefly in a specific window, the bathroom window on the building's west side. It was only for a few seconds each time, but the timing was consistent. Hassan was a creature of habit, and habits could be deadly in war. The next time Hassan appeared in the bathroom window, Jake studied the angle carefully. The window was small, partially blocked by a wooden shutter, and at an extreme angle from their position. A direct shot was impossible, but Jake remembered his training and the technique that had earned him his nickname.
Danny, you see that metal water tank on the roof next to the target building? Danny adjusted his spotting scope.
Yeah, what about it?
It's angled toward the bathroom window. Hot day like today, it's going to create a heat mirage.
I think I can use it to bend a shot around that shutter. Danny stared at him through his scope. That's insane, man. Even if the physics work, you're talking about a ricochet shot at over 1,000 yards.
One tiny miscalculation and you miss completely. I've done it before. In training.
Training is different from real combat with a high-value target who won't give you a second chance. Jake studied the shot carefully. The mathematics were complex. He would have to account for the bullet's trajectory, the heat distortion from the metal tank, and the precise angle needed to redirect the shot through the narrow window opening. It was the kind of shot that existed more in theory than practice, the kind that other snipers talked about but never attempted in actual combat. But Jake could see it clearly in his mind, like a billiards player visualizing the path of balls across felt. The heat shimmer would act like a lens, bending the bullet's path just enough to clear the shutter and find its target. It was physics and instinct combining in a moment of perfect calculation. I can make this shot, Jake said quietly.
Danny was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. If you say you can do it, I believe you. But we only get one chance. If you miss, Hassan disappears and those attacks happen.
At 3:17 p.m., Hassan appeared in the bathroom window right on schedule. Jake had been preparing for this moment for 20 minutes, calculating angles and compensating for every variable he could identify. His breathing slowed to almost nothing, his heartbeat steadied, and the world narrowed to just the crosshairs in his scope. The shot was unlike anything he had ever attempted. Instead of aiming directly at the target, Jake aimed at a specific point on the metal water tank where the heat distortion was strongest. His bullet would travel to that point, then the heat mirage would bend its path toward the window. Jake exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger with gentle precision. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, and the bullet began its impossible journey across the desert air. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, Jake saw the bullet's vapor trail bend slightly as it passed through the heat distortion, exactly as he had calculated. The projectile curved through the air like a guided missile, slipped past the wooden shutter, and found its target. Hassan al-Baghdadi, the bomb maker whose devices had killed dozens of American soldiers, collapsed without ever knowing he had been shot. Through his spotting scope, Danny watched the compound explode into chaos as Hassan's men realized their leader was dead. Holy hell, Jake! I've never seen anything like that in 15 years of combat. How did you even know that would work? Jake kept his eye on the scope, watching for secondary targets, but his voice was flat and emotionless. Physics. Heat bends light, light bends ballistics. Just math. But it wasn't just math, and they both knew it. What Jake had accomplished was something beyond normal human capability, a fusion of technical knowledge, intuitive understanding, and pure instinct that transformed an impossible shot into reality. Word of the shot spread through the military community like wildfire, and Jake's legend began to grow beyond his unit. The mission debrief was attended by officers Jake had never seen before, men with serious faces and classified clearances who asked detailed questions about Jake's techniques and capabilities. They wanted to understand how he had made the shot, whether it could be replicated, and what other impossible things Jake might be capable of accomplishing. But Jake found he couldn't explain it in terms that satisfied them. The shot had been as much art as science, as much feeling as calculation. He had seen the path in his mind and trusted his instincts to make it real. Trying to reduce it to formulas and procedures was like trying to explain music to someone who had never heard sound. After the debrief, Jake returned to his bunk to find a letter from his mother. It had been forwarded through several military postal stations and was 3 weeks old. Mary Morrison wrote about the ranch, about neighbors asking when Jake was coming home, about how proud his father would have been of his military service. But, as Jake read the letter, he realized he could barely remember what the ranch looked like. The Oklahoma landscape had been replaced in his memory by Afghan mountains and desert compounds. The sounds of cattle had been overwhelmed by gunfire and helicopter rotors. The smell of hay and morning dew had been supplanted by cordite and dust. Jake Morrison was disappearing, consumed by the legend of Mirage. And the scariest part was that Jake was beginning to prefer it that way. The sniper was efficient, focused, and untroubled by doubt or emotion. The sniper didn't worry about family ranches or unpaid bills or whether taking a life was morally justified. The sniper simply eliminated threats with mathematical precision. That night, Jake dreamed about the impossible shot, replaying it over and over in perfect detail. But, in his dreams, the face behind Hassan's scope was his own, and he was both the hunter and the hunted, pursuing himself across an endless desert where the only escape was to become someone else entirely. The transformation was nearly complete, and Jake was beginning to understand that some changes could never be undone. Jake's final mission began with a phone call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was 0300 hours on a September morning when Colonel Peterson shook Jake awake in his bunk. The older man's face was grave, etched with the kind of worry that comes from making decisions that send young men to their deaths. "We need you, Morrison. Emergency extraction situation." Jake was instantly alert, the practiced reflexes of a combat veteran overriding sleep and confusion. "What's the situation, sir?" "Bravo Company got hit hard during a patrol near Kandahar. They're trapped in a building, surrounded, taking heavy casualties. Medevac can't get in because of enemy fire from elevated positions. We need those positions eliminated, and you're the only sniper with the range and accuracy to make it happen from a safe distance." Within 30 minutes, Jake and Danny were aboard a Black Hawk helicopter racing through the pre-dawn darkness toward Kandahar. The intelligence briefing was simple but terrifying. 18 American soldiers were pinned down in a partially collapsed building while enemy fighters occupied positions in the surrounding hills. Conventional air support was impossible because of civilian populations in the area, and ground reinforcements couldn't reach the trapped soldiers without taking massive casualties. Jake would be dropped on a mountainside nearly 2 miles from the action, the maximum effective range of his rifle, and would have to systematically eliminate enemy positions while the trapped soldiers held their position. It was a job that would require every skill Jake had learned, every impossible shot he had perfected, and more precision than any human being should reasonably possess. The helicopter set them down on a rocky ledge as the first gray light of dawn crept across the mountains. Jake immediately began setting up his position, checking his rifle, calculating distances and wind patterns. Through his scope, he could see the building where Bravo Company was trapped, a concrete structure with one wall partially collapsed, surrounded by enemy muzzle flashes like deadly fireflies in the growing light. "Range to primary targets?" Jake asked as Danny studied the tactical situation through his spotting scope. "Jesus, Jake. Closest target is 1900 yards. Furthest is almost 2400. These are shots that shouldn't be possible with this equipment." Jake adjusted his scope and began cataloging targets. He could see at least 7 enemy positions, machine gun nests, sniper positions, and mortar teams that were systematically destroying the building where the Americans were trapped. Each position would require a different approach, different calculations, different techniques. The first shot was the most important. Jake chose a machine gun position that was causing the most damage to the trapped soldiers. At 1900 yards, it was at the very edge of his rifle's effective range, requiring calculations that pushed the boundaries of ballistics. Jake had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, air density, and the Earth's rotation, the Coriolis effect that could throw a bullet several inches off target at extreme distances. Jake's first shot struck the machine gunner in the head, instantly silencing the weapon that had been raking the American's position. But the shot also revealed Jake's location to the remaining enemies, who immediately began trying to locate and eliminate the sniper who had just announced his presence. "They're looking for us," Danny warned, scanning the enemy positions. "You've got maybe 5 minutes before they start dropping mortars on this ridge." Jake was already lining up his second shot, a sniper in a position 2100 yards away who was systematically picking off any American soldier who showed himself near the windows of the trapped building. This shot required Jake to compensate for an uphill angle and a crosswind that was gusting unpredictably between the mountain peaks. The bullet took nearly 3 seconds to reach its target, a lifetime in combat. Jake held his breath as the projectile arced through the morning air, then watched through his scope as the enemy sniper suddenly slumped forward over his rifle.
2 down, 5 to go.
But the remaining enemies were now actively hunting Jake, and he could see mortar rounds beginning to impact the ridge where he and Danny had taken position. They had minutes, maybe less, before their position became untenable. Jake's third target was a mortar team at 2,200 yards, the maximum effective range of his rifle in ideal conditions, and far beyond what most snipers would consider possible. But Jake could see the team preparing to fire directly at the building where the Americans were trapped, and he knew that the next mortar round might collapse what remained of their shelter. This shot required everything Jake had learned about impossible ballistics. He aimed not at where the target was, but at where the target would be when the bullet arrived after its 3.5-second flight time. He compensated for wind that changed direction twice across the bullet's path. He calculated the effective air density at different altitudes as the bullet traveled from the mountain ridge down into the valley. Jake fired, and, for a moment that lasted forever, he waited to see if mathematics and instinct had combined correctly. Then, the mortar team's ammunition exploded as Jake's bullet struck their stockpile, eliminating 3 enemies in a spectacular fireball that lit up the dawn sky.
But the explosion also pinpointed Jake's exact location for the remaining enemies.
Machine gun fire began chipping away at the rocks around their position, and Danny spotted a rocket-propelled grenade team moving to get a clear shot at their ridge.
"We've got to move," Danny shouted over the incoming fire.
"They're about to turn this whole ridge into gravel." But Jake was already lining up another shot. Through his scope, he could see an enemy sniper who had found an angle on the trapped Americans and was systematically killing the wounded soldiers who couldn't move to cover. At 2,400 yards, nearly a mile and a half, it was a shot that existed more in theory than reality.
"Jake, we don't have time for this.
We need to relocate now." "Those soldiers don't have time for us to relocate," Jake replied, his voice completely calm despite the chaos around them. "This is the shot that matters."
At 2,400 yards, Jake's bullet would drop over 40 feet during its flight. It would drift several feet due to the Coriolis effect.
The wind would push it off course multiple times as it passed through different air currents. Even the temperature difference between the mountain ridge and the valley floor would affect the bullet's trajectory. Jake made calculations that pushed beyond the boundaries of what human beings should be able to compute in their heads. He accounted for variables that most snipers never even considered. And then, as incoming fire grew heavier and their position became increasingly untenable, Jake took a breath, found perfect stillness in the midst of chaos, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took 4 seconds to reach its target. 4 seconds during which Jake and Danny were forced to abandon their position as a rocket-propelled grenade exploded where they had been lying. 4 seconds during which Jake wondered if he had just wasted their last opportunity to help the trapped soldiers. Then, through his scope as they scrambled to a new position, Jake saw the enemy sniper fall backward from his perch, eliminated by a shot that would be talked about in military circles for decades. The remaining enemy positions, demoralized by the systematic elimination of their most effective fighters, began to withdraw. Within an hour, a rescue helicopter was able to extract the surviving members of Bravo Company. 14 of the 18 trapped soldiers made it out alive, 14 men who owed their lives to a farm boy from Oklahoma who had learned to bend bullets around the laws of physics. But victory in war always comes with a price that extends far beyond the battlefield. During the helicopter ride back to base, Jake stared out at the Afghan landscape and realized he couldn't remember what Oklahoma looked like anymore. The mathematical precision required for his impossible shots had consumed everything else in his mind, leaving only calculations and angles and the endless pursuit of perfect accuracy. That night, Jake received a letter informing him that his tour was complete and he would be returning home in 2 weeks. He also received notification of a silver star for his actions in saving Bravo Company, and offers from 3 different special operations units who wanted to recruit the sniper known as Mirage. But Jake found he couldn't imagine returning to Oklahoma. The idea of civilian life, of normal conversations and everyday problems, seemed as foreign as the surface of Mars. How could he explain to his mother that her son had disappeared somewhere in the Afghan mountains, replaced by someone who could kill with mathematical precision but couldn't remember how to have a normal human conversation?
Jake's final entry in his combat journal read simply, "Mission complete. Target eliminated. Jake Morrison Kia, no body recovered." When Jake returned to Oklahoma 6 months later, he was technically the same person who had left to save the family ranch. The signing bonus and combat pay had indeed saved the Morrison property, and his mother welcomed home a war hero whose impossible shots had already become legendary in military circles. But the man who stepped off the plane in Oklahoma City was not the farm boy who had left. Jake Morrison had been consumed by Mirage, replaced by someone who saw the world through crosshairs and calculated everything in terms of range, wind drift, and bullet drop. He could make conversations with neighbors, he could go through the motions of civilian life, but part of him remained forever on that Afghan mountainside, taking impossible shots at extreme range. Jake never talked about the war, never explained how he had learned to bend bullets around the laws of physics, never described the moment when Jake Morrison died and Mirage took his place. He worked the ranch, took care of his mother, and lived quietly in the Oklahoma countryside. But sometimes, on clear mornings when the heat created mirages on the horizon, Jake would remember what it felt like to be someone who could do impossible things. And sometimes, late at night, he would dream about shots that defied human capability, about bullets that traveled impossible distances to find their targets with mathematical precision. The legend of Mirage lived on in military circles, passed down from sniper to sniper like a ghost story that happened to be true. Enemy fighters in Afghanistan still whispered about the American sniper who could kill from impossible distances, who appeared where he shouldn't exist and vanished before anyone could prove he was real. But Jake Morrison just worked his family's ranch, milked cows at dawn, and tried to remember what it had felt like to be human before mathematics and warfare had transformed him into something else entirely. The impossible shots had saved lives, won battles, and created a legend. They had also cost Jake everything he had originally joined the military to preserve, not the ranch, which had been saved, but himself, which had been lost somewhere in the space between the trigger and the target, in the mathematical perfection of bullets that traveled impossible distances to find their marks with deadly precision. In the end, Jake Morrison had become his own casualty of war, not dead, but forever changed into someone who could do impossible things but could no longer remember what it felt like to be simply, ordinarily human.